So, being a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, who have stopped living officially plural marriage since 1890, of course, you don't have to think it's good or ever was right in history or in church history or in the Bible. But when you start degrading women in church history, prominent women, and accusing them of being liars, I'm not okay with that. And the point I keep pushing in my videos is it was an aha moment when I started to understand what words meant to the saints in 1840s when it came to plural marriage. You guys, I have read letters from Emma Smith to her son that are so fascinating that I'm not going to quote right now, but I think I am going to go into, because it's really important to know what she said and did not say. I will tell you, I've said several times, she didn't want her sons in Utah preaching how polygamy was bad. I know that. I won't say any more right now, okay? This channel, if you're new here, like, I am an active member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Someone accused me of not even being active and just all these negative, horrible labels. You don't throw condemning labels at people, even if you're just being trite and funny. It's not okay. So that happened. I've had a lot going on. Life's been crazy. But I'm just going to share really personal things, okay? Watch my other videos. I'm going to go ahead and link them. The one about Joseph Smith's death, why he was murdered. He was murdered by people that were like Jeffrey Epstein's. And if you even research, though, this is not speculation. Spiritual wifery, you can find the definition and find the history of Cochrane, that it was free love. A woman was with several men and had no say about it. She's treated like trash. Okay, very similar to the Handmaid's Tale, where they were temporary wives.
I'm just going to verify really quick. One thing that I've talked about before is I am talking about the TV show, The Handmaid's Tale, that was based on a book, The Handmaid's Tale. And these women were like assigned to a man to bear them children, and they super abusive, no consent, they have no rights, but they also were transferred. They were temporary, which plural marriage wasn't temporary, but what was temporary and who did live in something like that was Jacob Cochrane in 1818. Ironic here, right? Lived something called spiritual wifery. So you just look at the definition of spiritual wifery, it was free love. But women with Cochrane, they were temporary, passed from around. No woman belonged to a man. And then J.C. Bennett lived the same thing and brought it to Nauvoo. And a lot of men thought that sounded a lot more appealing, because Bennett also brought in his skill as a doctor of abortion. So then there were no consequences. So all these women that were attacked by Chauncey, he said, oh, well, and one of their ways of, they just kept saying no in all their testimonials, which was his reason of being, his testimonials were in May 1842. May 25th, you can look it up. You can get the High Council minutes, and I've read that book. Meg Stout talked about it and really puts a lot of perspective in how evil these other men were that killed Joseph Smith. But this wasn't what Brigham Young lived. He denounced spiritual wifery, as did John Taylor, and all the apostles denounced spiritual wifery because it was very abusive and evil, and it turned into, I'll just say, trafficking women, right? And so it is often confused with polygamy, and you often find people in accounts from the 1840s, 50s, 60s, ended in 1890, right? Officially got 20 years for the church to say people were ready to excommunicate people if they're still living. It did take another 20 years, but whatever. It's how it is today. So you can read this. I'll always put this on here. But right here it explains, even here, this is an article on the churchofjesuschrist.org where they explain spiritual wifery. Men were living that, and they were seducing women. Abusing women, though, was mostly what it was. They don't talk about this very much. But when you know what this word meant, you know that they, in this alludes to, but you can look up the voice of innocence. It's a whole other topic. I talk about it extensively in almost an hour in another video. People accuse Emma Smith of fighting plural marriage, but she's talking about spiritual wifery and uses the word polygamy. But this explains, even in the church's gospel topic, that back then, the church, they're explaining, the church, carefully worded denials, this is commissioned by the church, denounce spiritual wifery and polygamy. It wasn't just Emma. She read the voice of innocence. It wasn't written by her. It was written by W.W. Phelps. Just look it up. I've talked about it before. Emma edited it. She took out the word rapine, right? Because she didn't want to trigger those women. She read it to the women, the Relief Society. They said amen 3 times, denouncing spiritual wifery like Cochrane lived it, which was happening in Nauvoo, which was abusive. Consent wasn't happening because it's from the devil, okay? And so 132 Problems, she essentially is subscribing to this ideology from the TV show The Handmaid's Tale, which then she subscribes to anyone called a handmaid in the Bible, which a handmaid really was a lot like Fanny Alger, or like just a woman that moved in, which still happened for millennia. Women would be younger and move in and help out with the house, help out with a baby. But we know details of Fanny Alger that, well, she was asked, her parents were asked, they got her permission. She was a time and eternity wife. But then she did end it. And then no babies happened, so not much happened, right? But it was an attempt at starting the beginning of plural marriage. But again, like I was saying, I was shocked and upset, and I'm going to talk about Lucy Walker's story was hard, because when you read parts of it with an ellipses, ... you're like, oh, this is horrible, but when you read the whole story, you get a perspective, and you're like, oh my goodness. Okay, one, she was 2 years older than I thought when she married him, because they always push, she's 15. You actually have no idea if she even was 15 when Joseph Smith talked to her about it. She's probably a month before her birthday. She's probably 16. She was 17 when she got married to him. And that changed my perspective a lot, and reading the whole thing, right? So when we have the Bible, this is worse than having a bunch of ellipses of Lucy Walker's story. Like, we have no details. We don't have the journal of Hagar. We don't know if there was a ceremony. We don't know if her consent, clearly she could have said no. So, but 132 Problems, when she was interviewed by Midnight Mormons, she basically did not want to talk about church history. She just wanted to talk about the Bible, because it's shocking, it's awful. She subscribes to this belief of how the Bible was according to this writer. But since God is the same yesterday, today, and forever, and I'm going to say it again, I think it's important to study church history, because if God said spiritual wifery is evil, denounce it. Read this voice of innocence, meaning women are, the whole point is you're allowed to be innocent. You're allowed to have consent, was literally talked about. And it's a whole other subject, but I've talked about before, and I found it throughout Joseph Smith papers, because Chauncey Higby was mad on that subject. It stung him, because he wasn't getting consent from women. He was evil and a predator. So anyway, you can read this. You can see the evidence. What I'm talking about is not speculation. They talk about spiritual wifery. The church denounced spiritual wifery along with polygamy. But again, if you read any account of someone going to Utah, they would say, oh, are you polygamous? No. It's celestial marriage. They'd correct them. We don't ever use the word polygamy. They wouldn't say yes to polygamy, but celestial marriage, because they saw spiritual wifery and polygamy as one and the same, actually. But today, the meaning of polygamy is codified to mean what they did live, which was a man with more than one wife. But spiritual wifery is the opposite, so it's confusing, right? But you just need to know this.
So when you have someone preaching and just getting so many views, so much attention, it really disturbed me, and it brought back these feelings. I'm going to share a very personal story of like when I remember feeling that tightness in your chest, that anxiety where you just don't feel peace. I felt peace about church history, and I think my message really just is, okay, I have faith in my Lord Jesus Christ, but I also believe that we have a prophet that is good enough of a man that he can talk to God. And he has the keys, he has the authority to speak and receive revelation for the whole church. A lot of scary things are going on where a lot of people are wanting to step in and say, I had a near-death experience. I received revelation for all y'all. He's not giving you enough information. I'm gonna guide you all probably to your death. I'm not gonna get specific, but I may as well. I started researching the tent cities. I've read books on the last days and the second coming, and it's always, they're really good books sold at Deseret. The one was, I don't know if you guys know, but like I'm in the early 90s when I was 12, I've got this book and I'm obsessed with the second coming, and most of it does come from revelations in the Bible, but there were a lot of general conference talks from the 60s and 70s. They talked a lot, very bluntly, about nuclear warfare, and unfortunately there isn't a country in the world right now that is not preparing for nuclear fallout. Do you want to be in a tent trying to, because you might be blessed and lucky enough not to be hit by a nuclear bomb and just die instantly. Or maybe that would be better than nuclear fallout, I don't know. But the safest place would be in solid walls, okay? And when the saints left Nauvoo, did they just continue to live in tents? I mean, maybe when some situations, but like the first time, no, as soon as they could, if they're gonna be somewhere a long time, unless you know you're traveling. And it's great. It's totally true that the church is like, hey, learn survival skills. You know, go to girls' camp. Learn how to take care of yourself if you ever, for whatever reason, get thrown out in the middle of nowhere. It's just personal revelation. Prophet's not going to tell all of us what to do. And if someone decides to do that, I get that that's tempting and it feels good. Like, oh my goodness, this person's going to tell me everything that's going to happen, while the prophet's just, oh, I don't know. People are, you know, some of these groups, I don't think they believe the prophet. And it's your choice if you want to go believe someone else receives more revelation. But most likely, historically speaking, like that Richard K. Young guy in the 90s was preaching, and I was reading blogs about I'm like, when did this all start? Like, he was talking about these tent cities, and he was making a ton of money, scaring people, and just saying Y2K was going to happen, and he was selling end of the world things, just preparation, like our church, taking advantage of a church that is taught to have a year's supply of food, and all these things are good. And it is important, like the people, but then it's been Julie Rowell was excommunicated, so I don't understand why active members could be following her. I just don't get it. It scares me, to be frank. But I'm just telling you guys my opinion. I'm not receiving revelation for you, but there is threat. Every single country in the world is getting iodine tablets, like all these things to prepare for possible nuclear fallout, because countries it's worse than it's ever been. We're really at the peak, and it's kind of scary. Safest place to be is in solid walls. So when the saints left Nauvoo, they built solid walls because of beasts, because of animals, because they knew what it was like to just live in a tent. If you're gonna be somewhere for a while and you're planning to, like, if you a house is the best thing as far as our Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. What is consistently in the Bible and taught by the pulpit is stand ye in holy places. And what are those holy places? What I've read books and books on the second coming. It's your home, it's a temple, and you receive revelation for you. Okay, like single women, the prophet has said that you have priesthood power. You receive actual revelation for yourself. This entire town, you heard about it in Paradise, California, the entire town gone. My sister's best friend was from there, and so my parents were like, they were all, my dad was trying to find that girl because he just thought she was adorable, and just like, I hope her family's okay, and he's like crying and freaking out, and like, because it wiped out the whole town, right? And I got a hold of her, and she said, my family moved just barely, I think a year before that happened. And then I met another family. Yeah, I'm from there, but my whole family moved a year before this happened. And then other stories of members that were there. Not every member of the church left Paradise, California, but just had a feeling, because she received revelation for herself, to leave her home. And then she saw the fire coming really fast, and she got out of there. And I want to insert another LES family. This made me cry, but just hearing them, just seeing it, it's just a miracle of them driving. This was in 2017, driving through, escaping Paradise, praying and talking about Heavenly Father. I'm like, they sound LDS looked up. They were.
That sucks. People don't do surprises.
please help us. Please help us to be safe. I'm thankful for Jeremy and his willingness to be brave.
Terrifying. Are we all going to go through the same physical trials? Should someone tell the whole region? Is all of Utah, is it only Utahns that are behind the 44,000? Everyone else is going to die and not be lifted up? That's, just really, I have to stop there because that makes me want to really say a lot of things about Utah, which is not my favorite place in the world, but I now look back and I could hear people talking about things that I know was taught by Julie Ralph, like looking at people, snap judgments. Everyone is black and white, there's no gray. No one's just doing their best. No one just has a health problem like me, brain fog, going, oh, I'm just trying to stand tall, and someone maybe with borderline personality disorder is just offended by every facial expression and going, dark, you should die. You know, how terrifying, how disgusting that is. It's so against everything that was taught in the last conference. Like, we all need to work on what? Like, being Christ-like, being kind, not being prideful, trying to listen to one another, not judge and condemn, because we all have a little mote in our eye. Okay. And now I'm going to tell like a really personal story about finding peace with plural church history and plural marriage. No, I am not like getting up there and say, let's bring it back. I know there are men that say that, and I know there are members that think inaccurately that you need it to have exaltation. That Brigham Young actually totally denounced that. Like, he said, no, you don't have to. And John Taylor, just all these things. I mean, I'm going to put a link. At least I found Brian C. Hales. I do respect him. I mean, they're scholars. You can listen to them and not agree with everything, because a lot of times I don't. You know, they have their own opinions. They interject sometimes. But he did do really good research. But he does skip over the whole spiritual everything. But anyway, as far as the whole believing women thing, I will be honest and tell you, I did read Lucy Walker's, because I was reading Joseph Smith's journal summer of 2017. So as I am making videos about this photo, I'm not telling you guys this. I'm not showing any videos about plural marriage or talking about church history at all. I mean, little bits start coming out, but it wasn't until I found peace with it that I was like, oh, I just feel like I just want to teach this to people, because it helped me to find peace, to not feel that tightness in your chest where you feel anxious and angry. And I felt that come back a bit last week with someone confronting me with someone else's research, right? And at first, I just really started to break it apart and just try to find something wrong with it, right? And because her story seemed too shocking, but then when I found out she was 17, okay, that really helped, because I initially thought she was 15 and went off and married Heber C. Kimball, and I'm looking how old he is, of course, and the first picture of him is almost 10 years later. But anyway, like 1844, 1852. He probably did look a lot better in 1844, and we just don't know. You know, I don't know where that picture is or if it exists, but she was 20 when she had her first child, Lucy Walker, but they twist and they try to push, so she was like 14, 15, you know. We have no idea if she was 14 or 15, probably was just 16, if that, but for sure she was 17 when she did Time Eternity Sealing and was married. She was 17. But she talks about how Joseph Smith mentioned to her that I can't acknowledge you publicly as my wife until we get to the Rockies. And at the time I was reading the Joseph Smith papers, and I couldn't find him talking about the Rockies. He was talking about Oregon. He was talking about where I grew up. Garden Valley in Oregon. I was like so excited, but I couldn't find it. I kept searching for the Rockies. I was like, she's liar. She's lying. And I was like mad. Like this, I'll just tell you, 132 Problems channel. That was me. I was like her a little bit, talking about Lucy Walker, but I wasn't making videos about it. I just was like, man, she's a liar. I don't believe Lucy. Probably for like 5-6 months or something. Well, no. Correct, because this very personal story here. Have respect, and a lot of people are not members of the church. I'm working with people who are not members of the church. It isn't really good for my situation or case to be all church history, you know, and my opinions, obviously, as I'm looking at how people are just grappling on someone who's just so negative and concluding some things. I'll just say, like, she thinks 132 Problems, she starts to try to harp on, she thinks like the Handmaid's Tale is how it was in the Bible. Like these women were abused and they didn't have a choice. And do I see examples of some women abusing some of these pro wives? Yeah, it sounds like it, but it's also some of it. It's like when I first heard about Lucy Walker, right? She's had little ellipses and it was like, oh my gosh, this is awful. But when I read the whole thing, I was like, oh, okay. But I did start thinking about her, and I was just being critical of anything Lucy said at first, right? And I probably said horrible things about Lucy. I was just really, I'm sure that she's wrong. So, okay, I would say that was summer, and then conference happened, and I don't think it actually was in conference, but I was watching in between, and they kept talking about church history. They mentioned like 2 or 3 times of different people who heard Joseph Smith talk about going to the Rockies. And that was the one thing I was harping on. I'm like, sure, she's lying because that's not true. I can't find evidence of that. I can't find it. But of course, I hadn't read everything, and each church start quoting different people. I was like, okay, all right. There was that, you know. And then another situation when I sort of found peace. I really found peace just finding Meg Stout's blog, and then I started talking to her, and she just gave me a free copy of her book. Like, she just a free copy. She's not trying to make money, of Reluctant Polygamist. And so I was able to see all of her sources and check them. And I started making YouTube videos, but then I took them all down because I was like, oh, but I don't feel like I can talk about it until I found the original source. But after 5 years, I found that I've read all the original sources, and basically everything's free online. But I just appreciate her helping me find peace and just understanding that spiritual wifery was condemned by God and our church. So it was not seen as a good thing. If you do watch 132 Problems, she gets really specific with the Bible and how, you know, it just, she doesn't talk about the Handmaid's Tale, but she's really trying to say it's that, and that there's no revelation at all. God didn't. And then she just sort of says, well, I don't like talking about church history. I'm like, well, why? That's where I counter with it. I think church history is very paramount to understanding the Old Testament and New Testament, and especially because when you understand how it can be totally different when you don't have the full story or everything that happened. Like we don't have a journal of Hagar saying what the actual ceremony was or said, or if there was a ceremony or not. We just don't know. We do know that she was like a handmaid. She was like someone helping out, kind of like Fanny Alger with Joseph Smith and Emma. But she was sealed for time and eternity. But she broke it off. She didn't get pregnant, no kids. And then so I just think when you understand in church history, they're condemning those temporary wives. So to be accusing that of being correct in the Bible, I totally disagree and don't see it that way. I don't think there were spiritual wives or temporary wives in the Bible. I think if God was condemning the whole church, it was commissioned by Joseph Smith.
Okay, so again, you can just go to the Joseph Smith papers, search The Voice of Innocence, and it definitely was written by W.W. Phelps, not M.S. Smith. And it was these accusations by Bostwick and Joseph Smith and Hiram were being accused of spiritual wifery. Still, it'd been 2 full years of that, because it's way worse than polygamy, right? It's way more shocking. It's horrifying. There were stories of women being trafficked. It was happening in Nauvoo, but Bennett's like, oh, it wasn't me. It was Joseph. But he did know that Joseph had a plural wife. Like he knew about some of his wives. So, but but he's saying the entire Relief Society is trafficking women, right? No, they were not. And then you can see here the Voice of Innocence composed by W.W. Phelps. And but what we have is Emma's edit. And so she was really softening it. You see her crossing out the word rapine, probably not wanting to trigger the women. But the women would get together and talk about these sensitive topics. That was the whole point of Relief Society. They were taking down a sex ring that was hurting and abusing women, and consent was not getting and women were being abused horribly in Nauvoo. It's in the Joseph Smith papers, you guys, but of course in their videos talking about it, they just want to be smiley and talk about happy stuff. Like they're touching it and they're like, oh, better not go there, kid might watch this, right? But just shows how bad things were in a letter to Emma Smith and the Relief Society from Joseph Smith in March 1842. This is really showing you and this amazing thing that is cool. The Relief Society was finding any man that was, or any women that were victims of spiritual wifery, which is awful and evil, and God condemned it. Okay, 2 years later, the entire church is going to denounce it with shouts of amen. But people were living plural marriage because it's opposite. Okay, so you can read this whole letter from Joseph Smith. He's clearly talking about J.C. Bennett, who's still in power in March. It's in May that he's excommunicated. I think he resigns, kind of like Oliver Cowdery, like, oh, I know this is happening. I have too much pride. I'm going to make sure I beat him to it. But he was excommunicated from the Mason Lodge, which sort of had similar rules because they did have enough evidence that he was, doing things with a married woman and one of the apostles, someone who was a Mason's wife. So tons of witnesses how evil J.C. Bennett was, right? But J.C. Bennett accuses Joseph Smith of spiritual wifery. Joseph Smith's like, no, we've got massive numbers of women saying you did that. And he knew he couldn't win because the Relief Society really went on the attack. So, of course, J.C. Bennett went on the attack of the Relief Society in 1842. Anyway, I think I'll just give you the links to each of these, but it ultimately was read to Relief Society by Emma Smith, shouts of amen 3 times, denouncing spiritual wifery, which was not plural marriage. And she also used the word polygamy, but so did Joseph Smith. And most of them until a few decades later, it definitely was codified to mean something else. And then they realized, okay, dictionary or whatever, polygamy is sort of the same as plural marriage, where it wasn't in 1840s. It's confusing, right? But it's important to know what words mean. And this is the Church Historian Press. Again, this is the church's own website. William W. Phelps with Emma Smith revisions. The Voice of Innocence. You can click and see images of the original document. Sometimes it wants you to sign in. But, and as you see, they're talking about John C. Bennett's spiritual wifery. Counterfeit practices, spiritual wifery, which women were passed around from guy to guy, whereas plural marriage, women was with one guy and not that much. It was opposite, right? But like the Handmaid's Tale was spiritual wifery 100%, but it was denounced in this shouts of amen by women who were willingly and understood celestial plural marriage. Okay, and it's evidenced by the memoirs of President Joseph Smith III. Anyway, I'm not going to bring up that one too, but I found several women saying, oh, yeah, plural marriage, and then he brings up spiritual wifery and just they get quiet. That's awful. It was horrible. Oh my gosh. And then just crying and shaking. But he doesn't get it. He doesn't understand that they're really different. And Emma's repeatedly trying to tell Joseph Smith III they were different. He doesn't want to believe it because then it makes sense, just like other people today, right? These are the words. So Emma edited it, and this led to, and I love how she just calls women the softer sex, and she's like, we're not weaker though, right? blasting, pious, poisonous touch of debauchery. She's so angry. She's pregnant, by the way, and with her last child, and she's really roaring. But it was written by W.W. Phelps, but it was to the women. And this same thing was written to the men, blasting the chastity of widows and wives. So a lot of those, it's going to be quoted in the Navi Neighbor, were widows of Hans Mill that Chauncey Higby attacked and forced them to live spiritual wifery, kind of like the handmaids tale. They're forced to be passed around from guy to guy, right? That was happening in Nauvoo. But plural marriage, getting consent, pray about it. Are you sure? What do you think? I don't know. Okay, like totally different than Chauncey Higby's like, I'm not leaving this house until you let me get whatever I want. Okay, Emma's very angry at J.C. Bennett. She mentions him. I'm not going to read the whole thing. I'm just going to scroll down, but you see her talk about, uses the words spiritual wifery a lot, and to the end that she does mention the word polygamy, but you can tell she's really angry about these poor Hans Mill widows. Been through so much. She's like, haven't we been through enough? You know, J.C. Bennett's spiritual life system is scheme. She knows that these women are really being trafficked and passed from guy to guy. Okay, and then does use the word of polygamy, but Joseph Smith denounced it. All of Utah really denounced it when you hear it for the most part. But even on her deathbed, she says there was never ever a revelation on spiritual wifery. Well, yeah, there wasn't.
I think if God was condemning the whole church, it was commissioned by Joseph Smith. I've looked in the comment section where people just don't know church. They don't know what happened. They didn't even read. You can go to the church's website and read The Voice of Innocence and find Emma Smith writing. And there's a statement there I don't agree with by whatever church historian wrote that there. But she keeps using the word spiritual wifery. And then she does use the word polygamy. But the entire state of Utah, according to Joseph Smith III, would correct him. It's not polygamy. They didn't use that word. And it seems very clear from my research that Emma, especially Emma, saw the word polygamy as meaning the same as spiritual wifery. And whether that was totally accurate to the meaning, it doesn't matter. That's what they believed, right? And so very likely Cochrane called it polygamy, maybe. But it does seem by the time Utah was official, it became officially plural. Polygamy was a man with more than one wife and not spiritual wifery. Does that make sense? Spiritual wifery is free love, da da da. But they still would correct people, even though in our day and age, it doesn't mean spiritual wifery, right? So God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. So I really believe that plural marriage was not lived abusively, that women needed, Joseph Smith had to have the consent of Emily to even hand her a piece of paper. Her face looked scared. He's like, are you scared? Do you want me? He said, do you want me to stop talking? She's like, yeah. He's like, okay. Stop talking. A whole year later, he doesn't bring it up a single time again. They live in the same house. And then the lawyer's like, oh my goodness, like nothing happened between you guys. You lived together for 2 years before you got married, time and eternity married. And they were making distinctions between time and eternity, right? We know that's what those words mean. Because if you've already had a civil wedding, you go to the temple and just in eternity, only sealing. Because that's for the next life, that you're still married in the next life, right? Otherwise, it's just for time until death do you part. But eternity, sealing, means you're sealed forever. So, and it's often for families. It's not always a marriage thing. And for the most part, it wasn't in church history, except when it was time and eternity, that was a marriage. And eternity only often happened, according to Fair Mormon. Of course, I can't find most of their videos because they took them down because they're like, oh no, it says Mormon. Prophet didn't say you have to take everything down in the past that said Mormon, but a lot of people did. So, but second, like, spiritual experience, don't make fun of me, but I was talking to a friend when I was in this mid-singles ward several years ago, and talking to this girl, and we're just sort of like, I don't know, in the millennium, if it's a millennium, would plural marriage be that bad? I don't know. And I said, wow, I mean, if God asked me to during the millennium, like, I would just at least want to have my own house. And the thought came to my head, you shouldn't have said that. Like, that wasn't. And then if you do read accounts of, like, well, I would just say, I don't know. They even said back then that it was best if they could all be in the same, but who could afford that big of a house? But in the millennium, I guess you could have a huge house. But for some reason, I knew that wasn't good to say that. I guess I thought I was joking around. I mean, again, I'm not planning on living plural marriage. There's guys that I've talked to that I'm like, they're really set and planning on plural marriage happening in the millennium. And I'm like, hold your horses, man. I'm just hoping and really disagree with the ideology that men who have self-control problems think if they brought that plural marriage, it would take away all their self-control problems. I think if that's how you get the FLDS, I think that is how they formed, because those were men that were abusive and had self-control problems and created a cult with polygamy, thinking that would fix their problems, but they're all sexual predators, and they started for the wrong reason. Because I think if you don't have self-control, you start controlling other people. That's just my opinion I've been thinking about lately since watching so much about it, right? But back to me saying, oh, well, if God asked me to do that, I want my own house. That next general conference, I think it was Elder Oaks, I have to look it up again, he started talking about polygamy and how a woman said that, like, you know, like, and it was in the case of, he wouldn't say who, but of course he did talk about how his first wife died, he married someone else, and same with President Nelson, first wife died, married someone else, and people have been getting online, I'm sure they know. So they're just kind of like, we don't care. But I think that's why they talked about it. Hey, I love both of them, I'm gonna be with both of them forever, so stop saying that Wendy's gonna be single forever, that she's just mine for this life. A lot of women are getting on these Facebook groups and talking and deciding for President Nelson that Wendy's just gonna be, forget her. I love Wendy, I think she's a great person. Just really terrible. So that Elder Oaks said that he was quoting, couldn't say who, just somebody new that said the same thing. This woman I was talking to said, oh, I don't know, maybe I can handle plural marriage in the eternities, but yeah, I would want my own house. And he's like, we don't really know how that would go. Basically, like, no. Like, he may not, he's very likely not going to go from house to house like Brigham Young did, but I mean, he couldn't build a huge giant castle. That would be weird. So he created a lot of like townhomes, which is interesting, you know, but he did keep their lives pretty separate, and a lot of them said they appreciated that, but then some plural wives were like, it is a lot easier if you're still in the same house and can constantly go find your husband and he's there, he's never gone. And in these Kingston group, the father's always gone, and they have way more wives than Brigham Young or John Taylor did. John Taylor did have a lot, but at least Brigham Young, double. It's up to double the wives, double the children. But these men can't financially afford it, and they're very abusive, and they just started it because they're, my opinion, I think it was like a lot of men I think are thinking, it's not fair, I have problems with pornography and this and that, like I wouldn't have this problem if I lived plural marriage. It's just not true. It wasn't true in 1842. Those men who had self-control problems were Chauncey Higbee, who lived spiritual wifery, unfortunately possibly Sidney Rigdon, according to Parley P. Pratt. They were committing adultery, and it was these temporary wives was happening, but they were excommunicated. So God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. I don't think there were temporary wives in the Bible. It was totally rejected. Like, if she's your wife, she's a wife forever and ever. That's what Parley P. Pratt said. Because I did a video about Parley P. Pratt and quoted him. And that's the Joseph Smith papers. So again, my intent is to be faith promoting, not faith destroying. And I feel peace, you know. And if you don't watch my video. You're not ready for it. You're not. And I know this isn't going to be like millions of views or even thousands. I mean, some of my videos have. It's mostly about the photo, right? But because that's more interesting, exciting, and uplifting than some girl saying, I believe the women. That's really not popular right now, to believe the women in the Temple Lot case, or to believe the women that were abused that were talked about in the Nauvoo Neighbor around May 29th, 1844. But that was their testimonies from May, exactly 2 years, basically exactly 2 years earlier, in 1842. And that's interesting because that's when a lot of eternity-only sealings happened, because there were a lot of women who couldn't divorce their husbands because it was very, almost impossible back then. It was very, very hard. Because Emma kind of did want to divorce Bideman because he cheated on her, he had a kid. That's like a couple decades later after Joseph Smith. So clearly, kids usually happened when you cheated on your wife. Usually. So, but she took the kid in. And she even brought the woman in and said, okay, when I die, you marry her. He said, okay. And so she stayed married to Bideman, even though he cheated on her. But Joseph didn't have any kids. Why? And just people are just kind of losing their minds. I've read, I'm very much at peace with it, having read the memoirs of President Joseph Smith III and everything Lucy Walker said. And she said they were too afraid to conceive. Right, what does that mean? To do anything to get pregnant? So clearly Joseph was respectful of what they were willing to do. I think it sounds like it was the woman's choice to not get pregnant because they would have looked like an unwed mother, because he would not acknowledge them publicly until they left Nauvoo. But of course, by the time everything, some women did get pregnant at the point where, well, the whole town knows we're living plural marriage and we're leaving. They did totally move in with these plural wives, and some of them did conceive after Joseph Smith died, but they already knew they were leaving. The ball was rolling to get out of there, right? So it was the whole safety thing and trying to avoid Chauncey Higby and William Law, who are pointing guns at Joseph Smith's face because they can't understand why they can't just treat a woman like trash and pass her around from guy to guy and make sure she doesn't have any kids, so there's no consequences for their actions. And they just get whatever they want. They just get the fun part of it, right? And the woman just gets destroyed. Okay, that's evil. And I don't see any evidence of God condoning that in the Bible, let alone Abraham, Isaac, or Jacob condoning that. I see no evidence of that. But if you watch the HandMaids Tale, you get the impression that Christianity has just promoted abuse and it promoted these temporary wives. And if you're like a handmaid, then you're a servant, and then you have no choice. Like, we have no idea. We don't know. The Bible is so, millennia ago, especially when we're talking about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Really long time ago. We don't know all the details. And you can't judge them. And just take a step back. I know it's so addicting to get into all this, but do you feel peaceful, or do you feel that tightening in your chest, and do you feel angry? Like I did for like a month or two about Lucy Walker. But then the Lord told me I was wrong. The Lord showed me in General Conference that I needed to stop calling Lucy Walker a liar and finding Jane Manning's account and believing, okay, even I didn't believe the two adopted sisters. Like, I just wanted to whittle away as many as I could, right? Like, I believed he lived polar marriage, but I was like, well, I don't know her. But Jane Manning say that all 5 of these girls, the Lawrence sisters, that's who they are, and Emily and Eliza Partridge and Lucy Walker, 5 girls were confiding and said, Jane, and she was this African American that was she was a free black woman that came from the north, walked, her feet were bleeding, Emma, grooms her and her friends in, and they bind their feet, that whole story, it's an amazing story. And then all of her friends find a job, and Jane Manning can't find one. And Joseph yells for Emma, and Emma comes down, and and they start talking. She's like, oh no, I could get, because they have a 20-room hotel. She's like, yeah, I need some help. I will employ you and give you money. So she's a job, making money. And she's like, I'll start right now. Okay, they twist this in Jane and Emma, because Emma actually says, no. You are tired. You go sleep. Don't do anything right now. But in the movie, like, oh yeah, come on, let's go do this, and this. I was like, why did they do that? Although they're trying to imply in Jane and Emma that Emma's the only non-racist person in all of Nauvoo. You just love everyone. Doesn't mean you have to love everything they do, right? So I don't have to love everything 132 Problems does, but I do have love for her. I get where she's coming from, but I don't agree with her making videos and sharing it and getting people to believe and think everything she thinks, which is basically going off on like the Bible's like the Handmaid's Tale. I just don't agree with it. It's just my opinion. Because I think, again, God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. So if he was against temporary wives, he was against it back then. And if God is telling Joseph Smith he has to get consent, he's be kind to these women, and even if they're afraid, you walk away. You don't continue pushing the point. He didn't. It does not mean there weren't members of the church that were abusive. It happens in every religion. Abuse happens, unfortunately, but I don't see... I've read what these women said, and I just find comfort. I believe the women, but I also really believe if you read everything, you'll find that he wasn't abusive and not coercive. I did not find that. I found that very like total opposite of it. What narcissist says, do you want me to stop talking, stops talking, and doesn't bring that subject up for a year until the girl says, I prayed about it for a year. What were you going to say? And he proposes to her, and they get married right then on the spot, and their time eternity married, and according to her, he didn't touch her, nothing happened until they had the time eternity sealing, and they were sealed twice. And someone tried to tell me, well, they weren't really his wives. Like, Emily Partridge wasn't really, she was like a spiritual wife, like she wasn't really a wife. I'm like, oh yeah, and I immediately, it took me like 5 minutes because I had just read it, and I keep things on in the notes on my cell phone, and I pulled up my computer, and because I knew I'd just read that second marriage was with Emma there, and Judge Adams, like he was a legitimate judge, was there with Emma, and I think Emma loved Emily at first, like, hey, let's make sure this is legit legal, like Joseph, if she has a baby, because plural marriage wasn't illegal yet, from what some people have told me, but they still kept it secret because they were charging thousands of dollars if someone prostituted women, which is what they considered spiritual wifery to be, and that was how Chauncey Hagee was living it, like he was prostituting women. So what prostitution ring did not go immediately from just that to murdering people, because that's what happened to Jeffrey Epstein. They killed the judge's son that was running that trial. It's really evil. Prostitution, I think, is very evil. It's very abusive. So, again, let's know what words mean. And I'll have to stop this here. I don't know how long this video will be. But follow the spirit. These are very personal stories of mine where I said something and then I watched Conference and I was like, oh, I just said that like last week, and oh my goodness, Heavenly Father, I think knew, and I totally disagree with 132 Problems, you guys. Her channel. I really, really disagree. But everyone receives revelation for themselves. If you feel you should not touch the subject of plural marriage, then don't read all the accounts. It's not required in your Temple Recommend interview to read the Temple Law case and believe them, but just know I do. And I've had spiritual experiences teaching me and showing me you need to believe these women and their stories.
Okay, and lastly, I just wanted to mention how I watched the show Sons of Our Mother, and what I thought was really confirmed. I thought that Chad Daybell was trying, in the process of trying to seduce Lori Vallow, found out that maybe she was really into the Vampire Diaries. I'm like, she must have been. Because the things that they started believing and teaching, I'm still confused if it came from Julie Rao or just him or combination. But Colby Ryan said that his mother was Lori Vallow, Daybell, whatever, was really into vampires. So of course she watched the Vampire Diaries and the whole thing, and the last 2 seasons, and she has psychosis. She's being told it's good to not sleep, probably not taking her bipolar medication anymore, and then having psychosis, and this guy's telling her, that TV show you like, and I know you like that show. Just how evil and manipulative. But that whole last 2 seasons, like I said before, was like what the whole reason she killed her kids. But when you watch that show, it just seems like, oh, this is my best friend. The last 2 seasons, she's possessed by someone else's spirit. I need to kill her and bring her real spirit back. And it just kept happening on that show. It's a TV show. And Colby said his mom was really into those shows. So there you go. Some evil, manipulative, seducing man finds out she's into that show, convinces her not sleeping is not a weakness, it's a good thing. So you can get her to have more psychosis. You know, I'm not necessarily having a ton of compassion for Lori, but that guy's evil. It's just so messed up, and it's such a sad story. And I don't know how many of these people still believe in zombies and still are just looking at people and turning into Calvinists, to be honest. They're not members of Church of Christ Latter-day Saints. We really believe in agency and a really loving Heavenly Father, and that we are not to be judges. Like, we make righteous judgments, but God is the ultimate judge because he's omniscient. Like, he sees every detail of our life. He understands all of our weaknesses. He knows who's really just really sick and not trying to offend you and is just walking in a daze because they have brain fog or they're sick or they have a chronic illness. Whereas someone with borderline personality disorder, they get sucked into this group and thinks that they're God, that they can just sit there and look at people, like happened 7 years ago in a mid-singles, where these girls just looking at a group of people and just going, what do you think? Just like as if they're queens and they're gods. Just like, I didn't understand, like, what these girls seem so like ultimate mean girls. Like, these belief system is making you mean. Do you see that? Like, they're just pointing at people and saying, what do you think, light or dark? She's all dark. Like, I'm not even going to talk to you and get to know you so I can get information and find out if you looking at me wrong is offending and instigating my borderline personality disorder oversensitivity. I'm just going to call you evil and condemn you to die. I don't know if that's what they all believe. I mean, that's what she believed for sure. And it's evil. We're supposed to be Christ-like. That isn't Christ-like. You're supposed to take the mote out of your eye, realize that you're all blind, and not just start judging and condemning. That's the big key, is these groups of people are just condemning people, and Chad's just thinking he's God and just knows all these people that are possessed and there's no hope. We must... Come on. I just can't believe this is... I've read so many books on the Second Coming, guys. I'm not making my channel about that, but this is a lot of revelation. It's the very elect being deceived in ways like, you're just like, man, how will so many people get sucked in? And it is so many people, and it's terrifying. But I need to not be scared. You know, you need to not be afraid. Kind of like your Daniels and lion dens being thrown in with a bunch of tigers. Like, people, these are scary people, but scary belief systems. And I wanted to end it on a slightly happier note, but sorry, it's not. But I felt like I should put it in just because you need to know these things. You need to know a lot of these people claiming to receive revelation for all these other people are turning out to be really evil. Anyway, try to have a good day.